Well, the Department for Work and Pensions responded to that report with a statement. They say changes to housing benefits in the social sector will save the taxpayer around £500 million a year. It's only right that we return fairness to the system and ensure a better use of housing when there are nearly 2 million households on the social housing waiting list and over 250,000 tenants are living in overcrowded conditions. Well, joining me now, Labour's Byrne, the Shadow Secretary for Work and Pensions, and Nigel Mills, a Conservative who sits on the Work and Pensions Select Committee and supports the government's policy. Can you just begin by explaining to David in our film in Wigan, who's probably watching tonight, why it makes sense for him to lose his home of decades while he's suffering from leukemia and charging the taxpayer more when he moves into private sector accommodation?
Well, the reason behind this policy, firstly, is we've got, as you've just said, about 2 million people on a social housing waiting list. If you rent in the private sector, you don't get extra benefit to pay for a spare room. If you live in your own house, you don't get benefit to pay for that. So it's just social housing tenants who do get that.
Doesn't make sense for him, though, does it?
But I think we have to go out and say to people, is it fair that the taxpayer pays people to have a spare room at a time when we need to get this benefit bill down?
Does it make sense in that example? There's a real-world example with one person. Does it make sense in
the government
case?
have put in place a fund for people who are in certain situations where the loss is particularly acute. But we have to look at the situation of, is it right that we're paying people to stay in a house which is bigger than they actually need? And we have millions of people who are living in houses that are too small for their need.
Byrne, the government does say it's going to save £500 million despite examples like the one in our film.
Well, I think your example just shows how that is simply not going to be the case. And of course, we know that Eric Pickles, Private Secretary, wrote to David Cameron last year to say that this is a policy that could indeed cost more than it saves. And the problem here is that people are being put in a trap from which the only escape are options which cost the taxpayer more. So the government's own assessment says there aren't enough houses for people hit by this tax to move into. Now, you can do two things. You can either become homeless, that costs the taxpayer more, or you can move into the private rented sector where rents are higher. But
that may just be a sort of a North of England or Wigan issue in terms of the housing stock there, and it might be a different story in the southeast of England, for example.
It would be nice if that's true, but unfortunately it's not. There's 660,000 people that are going to be hit by this, and the government's own assessment published last year said there will not be enough places for these people to move into.
Nigel Mills?
Well, I think we have to ask the question. I suspect these social houses that people move out of won't stay empty. So people will be moving into them who presumably are currently in the private rented sector. So it's not a one-way street, this. But yeah, the government's numbers are that this is a £500 million saving at a time when I think everyone accepts the housing benefit bill is too high and needs to come down. I think Liam himself even accepts that. So we need measures to actually get the bill down. And this is one of those ones.
We just think the government has got this wrong. I mean, these figures are literally made up. These savings are not going to materialise. And I'm afraid it's another example of the chaos that is now gripping the DWP. We've got a work programme that doesn't work, universal credit disappearing into the sunset, and now we've got a housing benefit reform that is actually going to cost more than it saves.
You still haven't answered the example in the film, though, have you? I mean, here's a man who's going to move out because the government says he shouldn't have a spare room, but his benefits bill is going to be higher when he moves out. So it's going to end up costing us more. Why does that make sense?
Well, I mean, that's one example. We don't know that
so that doesn't you accept that doesn't make sense?
I think you have to look. If
no, hang on, stick to this case. Do you accept that doesn't make sense?
If someone moves into his house who is currently in a private rented sector paying more, you've not actually had one person go out and pay more. You've had somebody else coming in who's now claiming a lower benefit. But, I mean, I don't want to... I mean, he's obviously in a very difficult situation, but he was using that spare room for storage. He doesn't need that room at a time when we have people who are living in cramped housing conditions. So, I mean, there's clearly not...
Answer that point, because there's a lot of sympathy for that.
I will answer this point directly. 2/3 of the people who are hit by this are disabled. Now, very often, they will have additional needs, such, for example, the need for carers to stay over at weekends and that kind of thing.
Yes, but he wasn't disabled. He was just using, that's a fair point, isn't it? Well, I mean, he was using it for storage.
To be fair,
why should he get that
spare room? To be fair, you don't know whether a carer is actually joining him at the weekend or at some point during the week to look after him. Certainly, many disabled people do need that spare space for things like carers, for things like equipment, for things like oxygen cylinders. Now, those disabled people will be, by and large, the people who will be hit. And let's remember, this comes into place on the 1st of April when a whopping great tax cut is being given to the nation's millionaires. I'm afraid this choice that the government's making simply isn't fair.
Well, I mean, we know that's a mute argument. I think everybody agrees we need to reform benefits and get these, stop these bills, these rising. I mean, the housing benefit bill nearly doubled under the Labour Party. I think Liam does accept we need to get this bill down. And frankly, calling this a bedroom tax is ridiculous. I mean, this is a benefit change to stop the taxpayer paying for spare
So you do
rooms,
not accept that this may end up costing more?
No. I mean, no. I mean, the government's numbers show it's going to make a
If it does,
saving.
it will clearly be a mistake, won't it?
Well, I mean, reform that ends up costing more wouldn't be a great idea, would it? I mean, I just think, we said that the Labour Party clearly understand that if they try and badge things as welfare reform, they know they're losing their arguments. They're trying to claim these things as a tax, which they know it's not, to try and find some political spin out of this. I mean, I think we have to ask the question, is it right that people on low incomes are paying taxes to fund a spare room for people when they can't have that themselves?
Nigel Mills, Liam Byrne, thank you both very much.